even if we have to see it in that format.
Go.
We're all a go-go. Thanks, Emily. Okay, thank you for the introduction. It's lovely to be here to speak with you. We were anticipating that it was going to be a lunch meeting in person, but of course we need to be flexible in these COVID times, so we're back to doing things on screen. So hopefully some people outside of Wellington are able to join us as well. So I'm going to work through the topic today. The slide that you see is an overview of the topic that I'm going to speak to. So we'll cover when is a small d dispute a capital D dispute. Then I'll talk about what are some of the red flags that your project is heading down the dispute path. We'll talk about when is disagreement constructive and when is it not. And what does de-escalating conflict look like? And then we'll just touch on a bit the difference between arbitration, mediation and conciliation, because these are the formal processes that are usually used in terms of resolving disputes in contracts and in projects. So Emily gave an introduction to me, but I've also been involved in projects and contracts in the public and private sector, and I've been a director on a company, an IT company, and also a company in the printing and manufacturing area. So I've had experience working with disputes both at the end of being a party, you know, a company, and also as a dispute resolver. So if we'll move on now to when is a small d dispute a capital D dispute? So dispute as a word is used to cover a wide range of arguments and disagreements. Usually in contracts, there are dispute resolution provisions, and that is the formal dispute resolution way of dealing with disputes. But it's often confused where people talk about being in a dispute, and I'm going to put to you that it helps to understand the difference of being in a dispute with a small d as opposed to one being a capital D, which is a more formal dispute. Because if we're looking at de-risking disputes, we don't want to escalate them before we need to escalate them. So usually in a capital D dispute, there's been a breach, you know, in the terms of the contract, or something's been done or not been done that should have been done. So some examples of I guess more formalised significant disputes are the failing to meet milestones or deadlines in a contract, or the failing to do work up to the adequate standard, or failing in compliance, or simply not delivering. And of course, failing to pay. So many disputes that I get to deal with in a formal way in mediation or arbitration are triggered and arise out of people failing to pay. But nearly every time, it's not just a simple non-payment. There's usually something that goes on behind that, such as breaches or lack of performance. And, you know, often think that if these matters were dealt with at the time, they wouldn't end up needing to be resolved in a formal, expensive process at the end. And a capital D dispute, generally, I would say, I would define it as one that triggers the dispute resolution clauses under the contract. So, you know, heading down the dispute pathway from a small d dispute to a capital D dispute is part of the, I guess, the journey that many of you will be involved in terms of delivering contracts and projects. So Emily, if we move on to the next slide and just talk about some of the red flags that your project is heading down the dispute pathway. So the most common ways of knowing or recognising red flags when you're working in a project, of course, is failing deadlines. You know, and sometimes it's inevitable that deadlines can't be met. Sometimes it's outside of your control, and that deadlines can't be met, but often failure to meet deadlines is a trigger for the dispute resolution provisions. Also, payments not being made and progress payments not being made at the right time in the event of, for example, construction or infrastructure projects. Another red flag is where you see performance slipping. So the failure to perform not just the contract or the project, but actually the quality of the work is often a red flag that something's going awry and may need investigating. Simply tired and grumpy people is a red flag that you might end up, in a more formal dispute. And difficult behaviours of people, because there's a strong interpersonal aspect in terms of delivering projects, and of course complaints or threats of legal action. So all of these things can be red flags of something kind of going awry on the project. Doesn't mean to say that you're in the midst of a dispute at that time, but these are the sorts of things that manifest. So now talking about when disagreement is constructive and when it's not. So the fact that those red flags might be there doesn't necessarily mean that disaster is pending. But where disagreements arise, sometimes it can be constructive because it really signals that there might be a problem. And it's not always a bad thing. So disagreements, a natural part of human behaviour, human interaction. And in the context of contracts, then it can be an indication and highlighting a problem that might need to be addressed. So the positives about disagreement is it motivates people into action. However, often disagreement is not constructive, and it really transpires in the list of things I've put up there on the slide. So, when it becomes quite destructive and doesn't help get to where everyone wants to be is when it reinforces bad behaviour, the blame game, and people not engaging, when it masks the real problem. So the disagreements and the personal behaviour mask actually what the source of the problem is. It's not constructive when it enables people to hold fixed positions, because as soon as people get positional, they don't understand where other people are coming from. And you're less likely to actually get to the source of the problem. Not constructive when it blocks exploring options for solutions, and when arguing stops us from understanding other people. So, disagreement in itself is not bad, but if the behaviours and the attitudes are allowed to manifest, then they take us further away from solving the problem and don't bring us closer to it. So moving on to the next slide in terms of how then do we escalate conflict so that we don't have disagreements? So, I said that disagreements were a natural part of human behaviour and human interaction. And so is conflict, disagreement and conflict are on the same page, really, and conflict is an integral part of disputes. I wouldn't say that conflict is an integral part of life. We can have disagreements without it escalating to conflict. So what then is conflict? So I take from Fisher here. He says conflict's the incompatibility of goals between two or more parties in a relationship, combined with attempts to control each other and antagonistic feelings toward each other. So conflict's more than just, one person saying they don't agree with another, or one part of a project team saying they don't agree with how things are to be delivered, or one party in a contract saying they don't agree with the interpretation of the contract. It's more than that. Conflict is really about heightened emotions, and people being exceptionally positional in defending their own views, and I did a bit of work on understanding conflict in a political environment a while ago. And what I found interesting was to understand why people are active and motivated in conflict. And, that's part of human behaviour as well, because when we uphold a conflict, what it does enable us to feel that we're right. It really supports our own position of righteousness. So I think to understand the behaviours as being human behaviours set from a contract or a project plan that is about delivering, objectively delivering either a service or a product or a piece of infrastructure. We need to understand a bit more about people to understand why they react in a particular way and why certain projects, the behaviours escalate to the point where there's conflict and disagreement to the point that it actually heads down the dispute pathway. So conflict is driven mostly by misunderstandings, by beliefs and by behaviours. I think it's very easy for us to look at people who we might think are demonstrating bad behaviour, and sometimes it's as simple as that. But what sits behind that, I think the behaviour is how people express themselves in conflict, but where does it come from? What's the source? Often it's a misunderstanding. Often that misunderstanding comes from a lack of ignorance, in an ungracious way. We might say that people are ignorant, but what is ignorance? Ignorance is simply not having the knowledge and understanding of things in the same way that you do, and perhaps not having the same perspective as you do. And that perspective comes from everything that you know and your beliefs and your behaviours associated with that as well. So often we end up in conflict because we don't know how to deal with it. And some of it comes back from our own personal and family behaviours, that we know how to escalate, we know how to get our own way. We know, we might know with the best intentions that our point of view is a better point of view in regards to delivering a project, but that doesn't always get us constructively down the pathway to resolving it. And escalated conflict is often a source of a project ending up being in difficulty and ending up needing to use the formal provisions of dispute resolution in the project. So I think if we move on to the next slide, Emily, let's talk a little bit about what does de-escalating conflict look like. And so this is what it looks like, what the outcome might be, and then we'll talk a bit about the why and how we can get there and the tools that we can use to actually de-escalate conflict. So I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have been in a situation, either in a working relationship or in a project or trying to deliver on some contract terms, that things have escalated, and it would be really nice to get things back on track and be more constructive about how the work's delivered. De-escalated conflicts means that we're able to see the issues for what they are, separate the people's positions from their interests, in fact, separate the people from the problem. So I've talked a bit about behaviours and how behaviours and beliefs and understandings are a significant part of, I guess, why projects end up derailing, because you can't separate the doing from the people. So when we can separate the people from the problem, that helps us to take some of the heat out of the conflict and to understand what's going on. When conflict's de-escalated, relationships are more constructive, they're less personal, they're less bitter. Less of the behaviours like people stonewalling or just being plain mean. Behaviours improve and there's less antagonism, and people engage rather than avoid. And you need these kind of situations to be able to solve a problem. So the problems get solved and people are more productive and less stressed. So remember back on that earlier slide talking about some red flags that your project is heading down a dispute pathway, I talked about tired and grumpy people. Tired and grumpy people are a symptom of another problem, and people that demonstrate difficult behaviours. Some of that might be the person's personality. Some of that might be directly related to their work, but it helps to understand that. That's like a bit of a barometer, I think. That saying, being the canary in the mine, it pays to kind of investigate why people are behaving in a particular way. Because when we understand that and can kind of put some support and remedy some of the problems relating to that, that is a very constructive way in the earlier days to de-escalate conflict, to avoid it going down the dispute path. Because failing to do that, if you've got tired, stressed people, if you've got deadlines that are failing, if performance is slipping, really that's establishing a situation that is ripe for dispute and ripe for triggering the requirements under a project or a contract to end up going down the capital D dispute pathway. So let's just move on and now talk about elements for de-escalation, because it's all very easy for me to say, this is what, this is the source of conflict, and this is how disagreements escalate, and then on the other side, de-escalating conflict, looks like a more constructive work environment and a more constructive way of working through a project. But how do we do that? So on this slide, I'm going to talk about the key elements for de-escalation. So when we understand that human interaction and I guess human endeavour, the tasks that we carry out, have a number of components. And I think they have, I've listed here 4 key components around how we function and the aspects that we bring to our work and to deliver the tasks of what we need to do. So the first one I want to talk about is process. Oh, actually, no, I'm going to talk about that last. Process is my favourite subject because I think that process can provide a number of remedies for us. But let's talk about communication. Communication and behaviour. I think there's a lot of assumptions around people who maybe don't demonstrate appropriate behaviours for the particular situation, or people that others think don't communicate well. I think there's a real temptation to think that the problem is simply behaviour and communication. But I think it's broader than that and more complex than that. I think it's easier for us to understand, we know in our workplace and in our teams, the people that are good communicators and the people that are not, and communication can't compensate for everything, but it does help in terms of how we work through problems. And of course, behaviours, negative behaviours, difficult behaviours are a problem in any work team or workplace. But those 2 aspects are elements for escalating and for de-escalation, because good communication can go a long way, good behaviours can go a long way in terms of people working together and solving problems. But the other 2 aspects that are not often talked about or thought about are actually process and thinking. So process, take for example a project that you're working on or your team's working on, or maybe a project, just a process of you doing your own work. Process is very helpful in terms of getting us where we are to where we need to go. In our workplace, process is like a framework of how, it involves, you know, a bit of a map, some, I guess that the milestones sit inside process contracts, are process tools. Process, I see as how we get from where we are to where we're going. Take, for example, as a mediator, mediation has a process. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You know, you start at the beginning with a dispute or conflict. At the end, the expectation is that as a mediator, you've helped people resolve their conflict, but you don't get from the beginning to the end without a process. And the process of mediation really is about getting the parties engaged, to participate, to have some trust with you as a mediator, to help them identify the problems and to come up with some options and solutions for resolving their conflict or their dispute. And at the end, usually there's a verbal or a written agreement that captures what the parties have agreed, and that's a commitment that their dispute's resolved, and they go off and deliver what they've agreed. So that's an example of a process. And I'm sure that you can relate to many other examples in your own work where you rely heavily upon process to get you from A to Z. So in the context of conflict and de-escalating conflict, to have a good process, either written or thought through, to know where you are in your process, is I think is a key thing to helping us keep conflict at bay. You know, in a formal sense, contracts have very prescriptive processes. For example, construction contracts or infrastructure contracts, very specific processes that trigger consequences if things are not delivered when they're supposed to be delivered or as they're supposed to be delivered. So process, I think, is a really key element to de-escalating conflict. On the other side, there's thinking. We take thinking for granted often, but thinking is the component of analysis and reasoning. It's where we process our ideas. It's where our understanding or our misunderstanding comes from. I think we don't put a lot of emphasis on thinking in the context of conflict. So come back to, you know, what to do with this slide and this, I guess, this diagram on key elements for de-escalating conflict. It might help on occasions for you to reflect on this, and in the examples that you have where there's conflict and dispute, to use the thinking, analyse, understand what's going on. Is there a communication problem? Is there a process problem? Is there a behaviour problem? You know, is the thinking part of that we do to work out what then do we need to do to de-escalate the conflict or the disagreements that are taking place? Does there need to be some development of process? Does there need to be some correction of process that doesn't really apply itself too well? Is it a behavioural problem with a person? You know, does it require some discipline or some investigation into that person, or does that person actually require some support and help because they're struggling and not coping with what they're doing? On the communication side, you know, what's the quality of the communication like? What's the frequency? You know, sometimes communication can be too frequent or less frequent. You know, everything's applicable to the situation. So when you're aware that conflict has escalated, hopefully this will be a helpful tool for you to use, and to put a lens over that situation you have to go, well, what have I got? What can I use? How can we actually make things better for this situation? You know, do we need more process? Do we need an amended process? Do we need a better understanding of process? Do we need to deal with the behaviours and provide support to people? Either let people know our expectations of the behaviours that are expected, or if behaviour is a symptom of a person struggling and having a problem, how can we provide support around them, and what are our expectations around communication, the frequency and the quality of that communication, and using our thinking brain to actually analyse and bring reasoning to how that might be. So I think my summary of that chart really is to say to you that there's not just one element in de-escalating conflict. There's a number of elements, and here's an example of 4 that you may be able to use and apply. So just coming to sort of round off, I've got a couple more slides and then we can move to questions. I think we were going to do questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom. There are no questions there yet. I think Emily's going to keep an eye on the questions for me. And so if you've got questions that have come to mind, please feel free to start filling that up at the moment. And so the last couple of slides are what I want to talk about here is the difference between arbitration, mediation, and conciliation, just at a high level, because I find that the processes sometimes get confused. So these are formal dispute resolution processes that sit outside of the courts. And many contracts and projects have one or other of these provisions set out as a way of resolving conflict or dispute. I think I've set out here arbitration, conciliation, and mediation. Just comes to mind for those of you that work in the construction area. There's also expert determination, which is another process often used, or a decision by an engineer in the contract, for example. So, but coming back to arbitration, mediation, and conciliation, I just want to briefly give an overview of the differences of these processes, because they are quite different. They're a different process, they have a different approach, they have a different kind of preparation pathway. And some of you will have had experience in these processes, but for those of you that haven't, it's quite difficult to, I guess, pick up the nuances and the differences unless you've been through them. So arbitration, if we start with that, arbitration is a decision-making process where if there's a dispute, an independent arbitrator or sometimes a panel of arbitrators settles the dispute by making a decision. So that's a fairly formal dispute resolution process. Usually claims are set out and responses are provided. It's based on evidence. There's a formal hearing and the arbitrator will write up a decision that's called an award. So that's the more formal process. I talk now about mediation. I referred to mediation as a process as an example just before. So in that context, a mediator is an independent person that assists the parties to reach an agreement. A mediator doesn't make a decision, has no power to make a decision. Mediation is voluntary. Even if you're mandated to have mediation in your contract, you may have an obligation to participate in the mediation, but once you're in the mediation, you don't have to agree to things. It's purely a facilitated, negotiated process where the parties have control over the process and the parties have control over any decision or outcome or settlement that's reached. So that's quite different to mediation, quite different to arbitration. And in contracts, often they have a two-tier dispute resolution process where first a dispute is submitted to mediation, and if it's not resolved at mediation, then the contract would say it's referred to arbitration. So that provides everyone with the opportunity in the first instance to use mediation to try and resolve it, where everyone hopefully works together to come up with a solution. And if they're unable to do that, then it goes to arbitration where an independent third party makes a decision. Now, some of you might have come across conciliation. That kind of sits somewhere in between. So a conciliation starts like a mediation where the conciliator assists the parties to reach an agreement on the dispute. And if the parties aren't able to reach agreement in that meeting, the conciliator is then able to make a recommendation to settle the dispute. So I act as an arbitrator and conciliator and mediator in different situations, and it's usually the contracts that determine which process is applicable. So as a conciliator, I work, there's quite a few contracts in the agricultural and farming sector that have conciliation provisions in it, and how they operate is that you work with the parties to try and reach some agreement on some or all of the dispute. And then if they're not able to agree, you can bridge the gap as a conciliator and make a recommendation for settling the dispute. And if the parties accept that, then that becomes binding on the parties as a determination. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of just setting out the differences between the formal dispute resolution processes, should all of those other things that you've tried don't succeed. So just wrapping up my presentation with this last slide, just the key points of summary that I share with you are what can we do to de-risk disputes. So first of all, make an effort to understand what's going on. And in saying understanding what's going on, look back at some of those tools I mentioned earlier. What's the problem? And then thinking further into, is the problem, what's the source of the problem? Is it a process problem? Is it a communication problem? Is it a behaviour problem? Do some analysis of what you've deduced from that in terms of coming up with a rounded conclusion as to actually what's going on. Know whether you have a conflict, a small d dispute or a capital D dispute. So as I've talked, there's a difference between a small d dispute and a capital D dispute. A formal dispute that's triggered by the terms of a project plan or a contract takes you down a formal process. Where many disputes that people have, actually I would call a small d dispute, because they're actually a disagreement and a conflict about how things should happen or how they should be delivered or what's going on between people. And to de-risk disputes is you do not want to escalate a dispute unless it's appropriate to escalate. So just understand whether that conflict and disagreement is at the early stage, is a low-level issue that can be resolved by other ways than going down the formal dispute resolution process, can be a helpful way of knowing whether you want to get it resolved inside the project while you're working through the contract, or whether it requires formalising through the dispute resolution provisions. Improve communication, both in the frequency and the quality. Signal is a problem earlier rather than later. So one of the best ways to de-risk disputes is actually deal with things. Don't stonewall, don't avoid, deal with it and do something about it sooner. And finally, use the dispute resolution tools available to you at the time. If it ends up having to go to formal dispute resolution, so be it. but there are many ways of actually resolving conflict and disputes before things get formalised to that level. So that really covers my presentation, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Penny. Okay, so if you haven't already done so, can you please put your questions into the Q&A panel? Now I see that we've already got one question here. Very nice presentation, Penny says. I like how some of our disputes come from childhood programming. Given that, and your comment on fixed views, is it worth doing a timeout? I have found getting another person to tag in worked.
Well, I think that's an interesting proposition. You know, I absolutely agree. I think that in many ways we're wired, you know, we're wired by our genes, and we're wired by our upbringing and our past life experiences. And we never quite know what's going to trigger us in different ways. So in terms of taking time out, sure, if there's a conflict, an escalated conflict, you know, in the moment, in the day, use whatever safe practices that you can do. I think that experimenting, being a bit innovative can be really helpful. I think one of the challenges for us in the work environment is that there's I guess, employment implications about our behaviours. But if we're in a position where a person is really impacting on how the work happens, then it needs to be dealt with. So I'm not quite sure about how you tag out a person and tag in a person, but I think that's a great idea. You know, we all need time out, even ourselves, to recognise when we need time out of dealing with something, whether it's just time out in a heated moment or actually it's time out from the project so that we can restore ourselves and get some objectivity before we come back in, particularly with high stress projects. I'd agree.
There aren't any other questions at the moment. We'll just wait a moment. Hopefully somebody might put something in.
I think just, you know, the quote I've put here by Edward de Bono, you know, who said, this was in one of his very early books called Practical Thinking. I have to say it was back in the 70s, and before he even became popular. And he said mistakes arise directly from the way the mind handles information, not through stupidity or carelessness. And my observation as a mediator particularly is that many of us assume another person has been careless, hasn't paid enough attention. I wouldn't be so ungracious to say that they're stupid, but, you know, some people would. But actually, if you know, scratch the surface and look behind that, the mind handles information. Coming back to that sphere on the elements for de-escalation, the thinking, the analysis and the reasoning processes that happen when we work is often where we make mistakes and we make flaws. We make assumptions and we don't test assumptions. Other people make assumptions and they don't test assumptions. So communication is a key element, but to understand more how communication works can be really helpful in terms of working with people. So I see that we've got no more questions. Emily, and unless anyone wants.
No, I can't see any more. So if anybody can think of anything, oh, here we go. This is from Sue. Thank you so much, Penny. Some really valuable insight for risk practitioners to support project managers and operation managers.
Oh, thanks, Sue, for that. And, you know, in preparing this presentation, I had a chat to David about the types of people that would be here. Unfortunately, if we were face to face, I'd be able to see you and have some interaction, more interaction in terms of who you are and where you've worked. And so I've generalized my presentation, across contracts and projects. But I think that particularly on the side of process, that the key elements for de-escalating using process communication, behaviour and thinking is really helpful in working with projects, because projects often go over a long period of time. People build relationships, new people come in later, and it's difficult for them to fit into the team. So, I think that the interpersonal and the communication and behavioural skills that we develop become really important in project teams. And also for people to have time out. Sometimes we just get really fed up with working with people and we want to change. Sadly, that often is a consequence of people leave and go somewhere else. But, if we can look after a bit more of the relationships, giving people space, taking some of the stresses off them, I think that can help projects go much more smoothly.
So I guess if there's no more questions, and you can think of any questions that might pop up, get in contact with myself or Penny. You can see her contact details on screen, or just reach out to me through RiskNZ. Now, I'll take this opportunity to thank Penny for that presentation. I think we have all learned a lot today. Thank you for everybody for taking the time to join us at this lunchtime seminar. RiskNZ's lunchtime seminars wouldn't be possible without the support of our great partners and sponsors. So thank you once again. Oh, I think we've got something that's just popped up. Oh no, it was just a thank you. This webinar has been recorded and it will be shared with you all in the next couple of days. Please check our mailers, which is coming out soon, for more upcoming events. And if you already aren't a member of RiskNZ, please get in contact and would love to have you on board. Thank you once again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you more at RiskNZ events in the future. Thank you very much.